Hello, in this video we'll be looking at the content in Unit 3, Activity 3. And so this will focus on character, and specifically character in our novella, Animal Farm. So if we start, you'll have a brief introduction on kind of how memorable the Animal Farm characters have been. This book is over 75 years old, and some of the main characters are still referenced in popular culture today. So you still hear about Old Major's speech and Snowball's leadership and sort of the dominating dictatorial personality of Napoleon. Boxer and Benjamin are referenced in pop culture occasionally. So the characters in Animal Farm have lived on. What we're going to look at to start with here, though, is a brief sort of definition or explanation of what a character is. And what's interesting about Animal Farm is that the characters, by and large, are not human. They're mostly animals, but they act like humans, so they've been personified. You could argue that the whole book is essentially a personification. The characters are taking on human qualities. I asked you when we started the novel in Activity 1 to keep a character list. If you've been doing that, good for you. You should have a nice, fairly lengthy list of characters. This book has a lot of characters, but they're pretty simple and straightforward. So there's a lot of characters to remember, but usually they're fairly easy to identify and remember. So what you've been provided with here is a brief reference of the characters that you should know at this point. So we've got all the animal characters and all the human characters. In terms of main characters in the novella, of course, we talk about protagonist and antagonist when we talk about main characters, and Animal Farm is kind of interesting in terms of protagonist and antagonist. I would argue there isn't one specific protagonist in this story. I would argue that all of the animals on the farm, or at least all of the animals with the exception of the pigs and the dogs, kind of act together as the protagonist. Whereas the antagonist, I think what's interesting is that the antagonist in the story seems to change from the beginning and then into the middle and end of the story. So I'd be curious to know who you identify as the ultimate antagonist in this story. In terms of types of characters, in Unit 2, Activity 2, we talked about flat and round and static and dynamic. So I'd like you to be able to tell me about the characters in our book, whether they're flat or round, or whether they're static or dynamic. That's something that I could ask you on a future assignment or maybe on the final exam. So I would certainly consider the characters and make sure that you understand the difference between flat and round and static and dynamic. Character archetypes is something we covered in Unit 2 as well, and so I would expect you to be able to find archetypes in our book. And I would suggest that there's a villain, there's a mentor, there's a mother figure, a sidekick, and an innocent. I think those are obvious character archetypes in this book, and so I'd like you to see if you can identify which characters fit each of those archetypes. In terms of pre-reading for this activity, you can download your response questions for Chapter 7 and 8. So as always, they're a Microsoft Word document that looks like this right here. If you can answer those questions, you should feel comfortable that you know what I want you to know in Chapters 7 and 8. You've got your word study for Chapter 7 and your word study for Chapter 8, so some words that you might not be familiar with. And lastly, you just have a reminder about required reading. You should read Chapters 7 and Chapters 8, and you should answer your response questions before you move on to the assignment in this activity. If you have any questions about the content, or if you have any trouble with Chapter 7 or Chapter 8, please let me know.